Welcome back to Harvard Unboxed. Today we're doing a little benchmarking. We're going to play around a little bit with Assassin's Creed Origins to see how it behaves with different CPUs. For those of you unaware, Assassin's Creed Origins was recently released and it has been creating a bit of a stir in the PC tech community due to how aggressively it utilises the CPU. Upon release, a few media outlets scrambled to the benchmarks and it quickly became apparent that the game is extremely CPU intensive, and not in the way that Arma 3 or Planet Coaster are, for example. Rather than just taxing a few cores very heavily, the game eats up cores. Lots of cores, pretty much all the cores you got. There are reports of it eating up a Threadripper 1920X, for example. As a result, modern quad cores were getting slayed, and there were reports that the game was simply unplayable on the Core i5-7600K. And while that certainly piqued my interest, we've already seen the 7600K and other quad-core CPUs struggling in big 64-player Battlefield 1 matches, and while the performance isn't always ideal, it's certainly playable in my opinion. Anyway, I believe it was the computer-based results that have caused most of the excitement, as they showed the Core i5-7600K getting trampled by the Ryzen 5 1500X, as it only managed to match the Ryzen 3 1300X. However, it was the 1% low results that were the most shocking, as the 7600K dipped down to just 41 FPS, making it slightly slower than a 1300X. But I'm honestly not even sure how that's possible, but let's just ignore that fact for a moment. Essentially, the 7600K was 30% slower than the Ryzen 5 1600X and almost 40% slower than the 7700K. Contradicting this information, though, were some results published by Game GPU around 3 days earlier, showing the 7600K never dropping below 60 FPS and consequently beating the Ryzen 5 1400 while easily beating the Ryzen 3 CPUs. The higher core count Ryzen parts still did very well in their test, but the 7600K hardly looked pathetic in comparison. Looking at where each media outlet tested, as best as I can tell, Game GPU actually tested a more demanding section of the game, so that's a bit confusing. Therefore, I decided to have a look and see if I could work out what was going on. For measuring CPU performance, I found that getting on your steed, in this case a camel, and having a trot through the open world city of Siwa is the way to go. There's generally loads of non-player characters here that give the CPU a pretty hard time. So using a GeForce GTX 1080 Ti and 3 quality presets, let's have a look at some results in graph form before checking out some actual gameplay. Right, so let's start with the ultra high quality preset. We are using a GTX 1080 Ti after all. Here the 8th gen core series is limited to just over 90 FPS on average, with a 1% low result of 71 FPS. The 7700K roughly matched the average result, but was 7% slower for the minimum, as it was often close to being maxed out. Then we see a pretty large drop from the 7600K, which bottomed out at just 52 FPS, making it 21% slower than the 7700K and 27% slower than the Core i5-8400. This also meant it was quite a bit slower than the Ryzen 7 1800X and Ryzen 5 1600X, though it was shockingly quite a bit faster than the Ryzen 5 1500X. I would just like to point out that all CPUs were tested using the same DDR4 3200CL14 memory. I'll touch on memory scaling with the 7600K a little later on in the video, but for now, the 7600K as well as the 1500X both provided highly playable performance in busy sections of the game. Reducing the quality preset to high provides a decent performance uplift, and the Core i5-7600K in particular does much better here. Whereas the minimum frame rate for the 1500X was increased by 17%, the 7600K saw a massive 27% increase to 66 FPS, and was now able to deliver very smooth performance. The 7700K was also able to max out the GTX 1080 Ti alongside the 8th gen core processors. Dropping down to the medium quality preset only boosted the minimum frame rates of the Core i5-7600K and Ryzen CPUs by a very small margin. Interestingly though, it did boost the minimum and average frame rates of the Core i7-7700K as well as the 8th gen CPUs quite a bit. So this does of course point to a CPU bottleneck for the 7600K and Ryzen CPUs. Here's a quick look at how the 7700K, 7600K and R5 1500X scale when using various quality presets. We see strong and consistent gains as the GTX 1080 Ti is offered more breathing room with the 7700K. On the other hand, we see that the 7600K is pretty much maxed out when using the higher quality preset, while the R5 1500X sees virtually no improvement from high to medium. Okay, so we've seen the graphs, but I know there'll be those screaming that bar graphs don't tell the full story. The 7600K would have been a stuttery mess. Well, in an effort to head off that noise, here's a look at some gameplay footage recorded with an external capture device. All footage was recorded at 1080p using the ultra high quality preset, so worst case scenario then. First up, let's compare the 6-core, 6-thread Core i5 8600K to the 6-core, 12-thread Ryzen 5 1600X. Here you can see that all 6 threads of the 8600K are heavily utilised, and at times the processor is in fact completely maxed out. Yet despite this, frame rates remain high and, more importantly, consistent. The game was certainly jitter-free in my testing. For those wondering, the CPU isn't overclocked and multi-core enhancement isn't enabled, and we also have 16GB of DDR4 3200 memory installed. Again, this is the same memory that was used on the Ryzen systems. Something key to note here is the GPU utilization, which is locked pretty much at 97% on the 8600K system. But if we look at the R5 1600, and please note the GPU utilization figure is mixed in with the CPU thread, so I am sorry about that, we can see that the GPU utilization is usually around 80%, but does fluctuate quite a bit and at times drops as low as 50%, and this does suggest a CPU bottleneck. Okay, so time for the quad cores, the 4-threaded 7600K versus the 8-thread 1500X. Both CPUs were heavily utilised. The 7600K was just about consistently maxed out, while the 1500X sat at around 95% for the most part. GPU utilization was similar at around 70 to 80%, but at times did jump up much higher on the Core i5 processors, which is ultimately what gave it the edge. Under heavy load, I'd say they were much the same, but when the CPU was afforded a little breathing room, the 7600K ran away a little. The key thing to note here though is that even with a heap of NPCs on screen, both CPUs provided a very smooth and playable experience. I think that covers pretty much everything I want to discuss here. Let's just let the gameplay footage complete before moving on.
The villagers are drained of life.
No one in the Wahat could make a move without being questioned, threatened, taxed, or beaten. We all have learned to obey and keep our heads down. You see how it is.
Just quickly, for those wondering, dropping the memory speed on the 7600K configuration, a DDR4 2400 from 3200, reduced the frame rate by about 5 to 10 FPS, so a decent reduction there, but not that massive, and the game was still very playable. This wasn't a test I planned on doing this week. I do have something much bigger in the works, and you'll see it on the channel the next day or two, so I suppose you can consider this more of a filler. The main goal here was to really see how lower-end CPUs, and I don't mean low-end CPUs, lower-end CPUs handle themselves in Assassin's Creed Origins. In particular, I was really keen to see the Core i5 7600K, if that would get crushed in a game that we can now accurately benchmark, but that wasn't to be. I know the 7600K struggles in 64-player Battlefield 1 matches, but despite the beliefs of many viewers, it's absolutely impossible to accurately benchmark a multiplayer title. There's no point walking around in an empty map or avoiding the action, as that defeats the purpose entirely. Anyway, getting back on track, the 7600K played Assassin's Creed Origins just fine, and the section of game that I tested saw 0 frame hitches. I'm keen to explore the game more, but for now I'm satisfied that I've tested a demanding section of the game that's been tested by others with mixed results. That said, I'm extremely confident in my numbers and the performance shown here. It was disappointing to find that the Ryzen 7 1800X and R5 1600X couldn't hold a candle to the Core i5 8400, despite a number of things I'd heard and seen prior to my own testing. As many of you know, I really like the Ryzen 5 1600 series, and while it did lay waste to the 7600K, Intel's rapidly aging quad-core still provided playable performance, and the HT-enabled Core i7 7700K was able to keep the 1600X in its rearview mirrors. There's certainly more testing to be done, but for now I think we can all agree that Assassin's Creed Origins looks to be very demanding on the CPU and will utilise many threads. That said though, it will also play perfectly fine on the Core i5 7600K, at least for the section of the game that I've played. I'm not sure if there's a more demanding section. If there is, I will be very happy to explore it in a future video. Anyway, that's going to do it for this one. I'm your host Steve. See you again soon, guys.